Hi, welcome to Ask the Experts podcast at Pennington Choices. My name is Josh Alderson. I'm the Head of Fire Safety.
I'm Christopher Cotterill, the Operations Manager for Fire.
Today we're talking about lithium-ion batteries, the risks associated with lithium-ion batteries, and just recent things that have happened that make this quite a hot topic at the moment. So, what are lithium-ion batteries?
Lithium-ion batteries are something that's used in pretty much every device that is in circulation these days. Everything from mobile phones to e-scooters and e-bikes, the portable fans that you can put around your neck, things like that. And they are widely used across the country and the world as a large. One of the most popular things that they're being used for at the moment is e-cigs and vapes. Mm-hmm. So they tend to be in a lot of people's pockets, in handbags. They're sort of, on our person at all times. So given the dangers that are associated with them, I think it's important that we've brought a topic together for lithium-ion today.
And it's obviously a relatively new piece of technology that's sort of in everything these days, and they do a really great job at powering mobile devices. But what are the kind of risks, and should we talk about what can happen if?
So risks with lithium-ion batteries is they are self-sustaining in causing and generating enough oxygen that they can supply their own fire. So if you think about the fire triangle, we have three parts. It can actually supply all three of those parts of the triangle. So if it gets damaged, so a mobile phone, it could get damaged by being dropped or pierced, for example, or even if you've got one being used in your car on a drive, it gets a lot hotter than it should do. So it sort of starts getting hotter and hotter, and when it gets to a certain point, it can go into something called thermal runaway. When it goes into thermal runaway, that's when the device is basically going to be lost, and anything around it could be lost with it, be that by the explosion that could come from it, or that it's generating enough heat that it starts its own fire. Oxygen then gets provided by its own components, and essentially that's what causes the thermal runaway. You might find that if you are out in the car and it's a hot summer's day, you have it on your dash or even in a cradle, it might be that it might try and shut off, and it might tell you that it's having to shut off because of the heat. And that's what it's trying to do. It's trying to protect you from that. The problem is with cheaper devices, cheaper batteries that haven't been regulated properly, they're the ones that don't have that feature. So they're the ones that tend to go more likely into that thermal runaway and cause fires. With other devices such as vapes and e-pens, as I've mentioned, those are on a person. Again, mobile phones on a person. If they happen to get damaged, that's when the inside of the actual device and its battery, if it splits open or gets broken, that's when the reaction happens. There's been cases where people have had these devices in their pockets, handbags, or even just on the table, and you'll find it on social media quite a lot these days that you'll see videos of them either exploding or them igniting. If you've got them on your person, then you're going to potentially have a serious accident or injury from that. If it's somewhere else, like being charged in a kitchen, it could take some time before you notice that there's some smoking, or even that there's an explosion come from that. So it's really important that devices are looked after well and protected, especially things that are prone to being dropped, mobile phones, classic, and vapes and e-cigs. Looking on more larger devices, such as e-bikes and powered scooters, these devices, again, they get dropped and then they're being charged. If it doesn't get charged in the correct place, then we run the risk of fires occurring, especially in residential properties where they're being charged in communal areas. being charged in a communal area is an absolute no. They have to be a sterile area. They're part of the passive fire protection for a property, and it's really important that devices are being charged and stored in a suitable location. We need to make sure that in the event of a fire, the means of escape are always kept available. The problem is these devices, because they do get damaged, they tend to be the source of fire. And even if the area is sterile otherwise, they can actually promote quite a large fire without really having any other source of fuel. Obviously, you may have carpet and you may have wall linings, but they should be kept to a minimum. And generally speaking, they don't aid a fire too much. But because I've mentioned that thermal runaway, it provides its own fuel. On a much larger scale, when we go up to the size of an electric car, there are very little measures that are in place to be able to extinguish these. Looking at some of the history of the Luton fire in the car park, that took out a significant proportion of vehicles and the actual car park itself. I was in the area not too long ago, and it's a mammoth task of having to rebuild that car park. So it is a hot topic at the moment. It is important that we look at what we're doing with lithium-ion batteries and the devices they're in. And I think it's something that over the next few years it's going to become more and more of a problem as we're increasing the number of devices that we're using with them. But finding an alternative, I think we're too far away from some reasonable measure to either replace these batteries or have protection and preventative measures in place.
I think it's interesting because you've got a new technology that's come on pretty quickly, and the scale of how it's in everything that we use and everything that we interact with, it's everywhere. The infrastructure that we have just can't keep up with it. So in all cases, so there's the car parks that we talked about where, you know, you've got these old historic car park buildings that are not equipped to cope with the new risks presented by electric vehicles, and there is some new guidance about that, but we're going to have to retrospectively sort of look at how it's managed, and then, you know, housing e-scooters and e-bikes is a really big risk in housing, and where those are stored within the building. The building may never have been designed with you know, suitable storage facilities for that kind of risk. So where you've got short and supported blocks, these days new blocks are sort of built to house sort of mobility scooters, because it's a thing that you expect to be in place in that sort of occupied building. But more generally, these blocks, you know, you've not got the designated storage areas, external storage areas, which are ideal. So yeah, you want to make sure that they're not being stored in communal areas. But then there's also a risk that when residents do store them in their flats, where they store them is also really important, because if they're storing them in the entrance hall, the rate at which these things go once the thermal runaway starts means that if they're stored in the hallway, it can be very difficult to get out once the runaway started. But it's interesting to just highlight the risks and what can actually cause that thermal runaway to start in the first place. So it's sort of damage to the battery units, impact, denting, overcharging. So when you're using sort of, you know, non-CE tested charging equipment that doesn't automatically shut off once it's fully charged, and then exposure to heat is another really important issue. All of those things can start the process of thermal runaway. The reaction is explosive. The heat changes are significant, so you can be at, you know, hundreds of degrees in a very short amount of time. The toxic smoke is almost immediate. But then also there's the really important point where you can extinguish those fires and they can restart, you know, almost spontaneously, and that's something else that people sort of need to be aware of.
It is. The wider impact, especially with modern sort of purpose-built properties, is that car parks are being put underground. Fire crews can't get underground with the vehicles. They're being designed with charging points en masse. So I think one of the larger implications is that there needs to be an engineered design solution, because given that there could be a fire underground, pillars that are supporting the whole of that building potentially could be destroyed, and it's to what level is the protection available for that damage to occur. Again, that's an engineered solution. That is something way above what I've ever worked with, but it's something that I have to look at and consider when I risk assess. And it is frightening, given some of the smaller devices that have caused large explosions. London boroughs are currently suffering multiple cases where e-cigs and vape pens are being disposed of just in general waste, and when the bin trucks are picking them up, when the arm comes down, it causes that damage, and it's enough that there have been a number of explosions in those vehicles, which again, it's the knock-on effect is those vehicles are taken out of operation. They could even be to the point that they're written off and destroyed. So it's the wider impact that we're having and the effects from, not just the convenience of what these devices are. So it's something that I think everyone needs to sort of think of a lot more often.
Yeah, I think the device going by itself is one issue, and it's an issue that is really difficult to control once it's started. And there's been instances of people trying to tackle these fires unsuccessfully and putting themselves at more risk. But then there's the other consideration of what is happening around that thing while it's going off. So is it in reasonable proximity to fire loading? Are you able to store it in a relatively sterile place? So when you've got these things that are going off in shops, for example, that's the reason that they are so significant, because one all it takes is one of them to go, and then you've got a chain reaction of the rest. Keeping stuff clear of fire loading. But then back to that recycling issue. When you get to a recycling plant, that is it's a site full of significant fire loading, and once you've got that source of ignition, then you've got that source of fuel, and the sort of outcome is pretty significant, really.
You've mentioned guidance. Is there any particular guidance out there that people can go and look for?
Yeah, there's a number of guides. So relative to each scenario we've spoken about, car parks, there was a sort of guide published last year for electric vehicles in covered car parks and how best to manage the risk. It's all about sort of location of spaces, space in between bays with EVs, and ultimately proximity to the access point for the fire and rescue service, so we're not having to go all the way to the back to deal with these issues. The housing, the NFCC have posted a guide on mobility scooters because it's such a significant issue, and that sort of breaks down what the risks are associated with using mobility scooters, albeit it has to be done, but how they are stored, charged in residential buildings. There's some data in there about sort of the temperatures that can occur in minutes after the mobility scooter sort of starts to go. But ultimately, what should you do and how should you manage it? So does your building firstly support storing mobility scooters? Because every building is going to be different. Some may have designated storage areas in the building, some might have external storage areas, some might have nothing at all. And what's the best approach in each of those circumstances? And then ultimately, as we've sort of discussed already, when residents do need to store them inside their flat, it's better than storing it in the communal area, but there's still risks that need to be considered. And ideally, is there somewhere in that flat that the scooter can be stored, ideally behind a fire door, behind a wall that's going to separate it from the rest of the flat. Make sure there's decent detection to make sure that those residents are aware once that thermal runaway does happen, and ultimately they can still get out and pass the scooter if it does happen. There's a lot of guidance out there, and I think ultimately it's still a very new technology. We're still adapting to it. The infrastructure is still going to have to be almost built to support the use of lithium-ion batteries, and ultimately the guidance is going to have to keep up and catch up.
So with EV charging points, it seems like more of a specialist subject. Is it something that just you can have a general risk assessment on, or is there anything more that people can do to ensure that they're safe and compliant?
Yeah, so I mean, your fire risk assessment, if you sort of accessing the car park where those chargers are should identify that there is EV charging. So, you know, if it's a residential building, BS 9792 has got some new sections in it to reflect that, and ultimately those guides have been developed to reflect the changes in how we use buildings now. So they are covered in the assessment criteria, but it's not going to be a sort of fully conclusive assessment of that particular issue. You know, we've done stuff in the past where we've supported people with specific reviews of where their EV chargers are, what the risks are, ultimately how they've been installed, if they've been installed correctly, the equipment that's been used, how they're maintained on an ongoing basis. There's a lot of things to consider specific to that issue, that sort of really should have an individual assessment to make sure it's conclusive in all of the things that need to be considered.
So we've talked about vapes, we've talked about vehicles. Let's talk a little bit about tools. I think that's something that more commonly these days, lithium-ion batteries are being used. And tradespeople, generally speaking, don't just have one battery. They could have dozens of batteries. They are either being charged whilst they're using other batteries. They could be being stored in their vehicles or in the property that they're working in. Are there any solutions for safe charging or storage for these?
Yeah. The way that I always think about this is that where does buildings, you know, with commercial buildings, for example, where you might have a handyman who works on site and he's got an office where he keeps all of his, you know, drills and his batteries, and they tend to be sort of scattered everywhere, and there's chargers here and there. Ultimately, I think that's about process and management of that activity. So, you know, what are you charging, knowing when you're charging it, having safe charging times. So is it going to be monitored? Are you leaving it charging overnight and going home and leaving it in the building? What's going on around it? And then how are you storing your tools when they're not being used? So is stuff likely going to fall on them? Is it you're trying to protect the battery itself from being impacted or damaged to minimise the chances of anything happening with that battery. But as an organisation, if you're running a building where there's use of lithium-ion batteries, it's worth having a policy as to how do you manage those lithium-ion batteries in your building? How do you make sure that they are stored correctly? Do you know how many there are? What's the sort of condition they're in? Do you check them periodically to make sure that they are clear of damage? Do you, when your chargers break, what happens? Do you source an original equipment manufacturer charging device, or do you source it from a third party, and do you check that it's got all the ticks and checks that mean that it's, you know, been approved by the original provider or tested? All of those things kind of need to be considered, but the first thing starts with the policy. So how do you manage those tools and other pieces of equipment in your building, and then what do you do to make sure that they are, you know, tested and maintained on an ongoing basis?
So given the use of lithium-ion batteries, what mitigating factors can be implemented to protect against fire for them?
Yeah, so ultimately if you can't remove the risk altogether, then you can mitigate against it. So once you've decided where you're going to store the device, whatever it may be, let's use a mobility scooter as an example. So a resident is storing it within their flat, which is, you know, not ideal, but it's better than in the communal area. Ultimately, the location is really important. So as we've said already, don't store it in the entrance hall or on the escape route for that resident. If it happens, it's ideally remote from the exit so that they can still get out and they don't have to go past it. Some flats that might not always be possible due to layout or just general size, and then you're going to have to start looking at other mitigations. So where you cannot remove or relocate that risk to a better location, the first thing is going to be sort of, can you enclose it? Can you store it somewhere, you know, that where it's going to be separate from the escape route, so that if it does go off, that you've still got that protection. Where that's not possible, the next sort of consideration is you want to make sure you know about it as soon as possible so you can maximise your sort of available safe evacuation time. So that comes from detection. So do you want to enhance the level of detection within that flat so that you get any earlier warning? So maybe you've got, typically you might have a detector in the kitchen, entrance hallways. You might want it in every room so that your chances of detecting that smoke at the earliest point are the highest, and it gives you the most time to evacuate. Other considerations then, you've got things like fire suppression. So is there a suppression system that you can implement to control the fire to again give you that additional bit of safe evacuation time to get out once the fire starts? And then you've just got the other sort of things really. So housekeeping is really important. So if you're storing a mobility scooter in an area, are you storing it with loads of other storage? Once that goes, the storage is going to go and that fire is going to develop far more quickly. The ideal scenario, storing it out of the way of the escape routes, separate from the escape routes with detection, ideally with some sort of suppression, but ultimately well clear of sort of fire loading that's going to cause that fire to develop any quicker than it already does.
So we've been asked about e-bikes and e-scooters. How can landlords find out about them an earlier time within occupancy of a property? What can they do to establish whether or not they're being stored?
There's a couple of elements to it really. There's obviously the if it's a housing association, what their policy is towards residents using e-bikes and e-scooters and how they should be stored. There's an element of resident engagement, so speaking with residents, making sure they're aware of the risks, making sure that they know that they shouldn't be storing them in the communal areas, and what's the best solution if they are using those devices. Ultimately, the only way the landlord's going to find out about these things is if they're doing routine checks of these buildings. So if they've got a site team who go and check weekly, they're going to probably pick up that someone's storing an e-bike or a scooter in the common area pretty early on. Where those checks are less frequent, so if it's monthly, quarterly, or even longer, that e-bike is going to be sat there for a lot longer before anyone's sort of aware that it's happening. So the more frequent the checks are, the more likely it is that you're going to identify that there is a bike being stored, and you can take the action sooner to minimise the risk. So obviously bikes and scooters being stored in communal areas is going to have an impact on the building, but what about if we're talking insurance specifically? What sort of implications there?
So some insurances require it to be declared that it's a device being stored. Some will refuse cover purely because of past experiences with them. So if you don't declare them, and it is part of the policy that they need to be declared, that potentially there could be some instances where the insurance is void. So you could end up with a property that is potentially destroyed or partially damaged, and there not being insurance in place for it. So it could have major impact, not just from the landlord's point of view, but also from the tenant's point of view as well.
PCFRAs is really important. So we talk about, if they are using it in their flat, then you might want to consider doing a PCFRA because of the sheer risk of that individual specific to that flat. It may not be captured in the FRA. So there's obviously changes coming in April around RPEEPs and person-centered fire risk assessments, evacuation statements, and while they're kind of focused around ability to evacuate and get out of the building, the PCFRA element is a wider piece about general fire risk that's specific to an individual. So where an individual is using an e-bike or scooter and they might be storing it in their flat, that's something that should be picked up in a PCFRA because the risk is significant. It's obviously a big ignition risk and will significantly impact that occupant's ability to evacuate. As part of doing that PCFRA and identifying that obviously that specific risk, you can then at least start to take action. So the things we've already spoken about, so increased detection, where the thing's stored. If another part of a PCFRA is hoarding, so if you've got a hoarder who's using an e-bike, the risk there is so significant that intervention is probably going to be required, and there's various support that you can get. Fire and rescue service do specific support, and there's the wellness checks, but ultimately you want to capture these issues within the PCFRA do they pose any wider risk to the rest of the building? Ultimately, your fire risk assessment is not going to get in every flat, so it's about having the knowledge and resident engagement to make sure these issues are picked up and properly considered.
Thank you all for joining us today and listening to our podcast on lithium-ion batteries, and we hope to see you again next time.
Thank you for joining us today. If you would like to speak to one of our in-house experts, please get in touch either via our website or across our social media pages. Pennington Choices, providing property surveying, consultancy and project management services to organisations nationwide. Our expertise, your solution.